We are finishing up our series of Radical Call this morning. We are going to be moving on to Hebrews next Sunday morning, so I appreciate you if you pray for me as I have time to study that and dig deep in that. A lot of great truths in Hebrews, so if you want to read ahead, you're more than welcome to begin to read through Hebrews. My goal is to preach through every book of the Bible before I die, and I have accomplished many of them. I've never tackled Hebrews before. It is as deep as deep can be sometimes in there, and so really looking forward to spending a lot of time figuring it out and trying to figure it out. I'm not going to get it all, but I'm going to give you my best shot. All right, I can promise you that. But you reading it, you trying to understand it yourself will help as well. But as we finish this morning, the Radical Call, 5 weeks ago, we started this series, and we talked about Old Testament men that God did something radical through, that God did something through their lives or in their lives that was outside of the norm. One of those wow stories. And we defined as something radical as something that's not status quo, something you don't see every day, something you don't see from the average Christian, something you don't see from the average prophet or the average leader or the average person that you would come across. That's what radical is. And a call we defined as a declaration from God, not a suggestion, right? In my house, when I try to give commands to the kids, they're not suggestions, they're declarations, right? Until they don't do them, and then I'm like, wait a minute, you just cannot choose not to do these things. Because if you choose not to do these things, you're disobedient. The same is with the call of God. It's not a suggestion for us to live for the Lord. It's not a comment that we might take lightly. This is a serious declaration to action. God is a God of action. He calls His people to be a people of action. And many times as we put these together, these two words together, it's usually a radical call. It is a call from God to ask you to do something radical, something different, something out of your comfort zone, something that may be beyond your resources. And I love looking at the examples we've seen from the Old Testament. There are many, many more that we can look at. We can look at many through the New Testament as well. We could look at Peter, and we could look at Paul. We could look at John. We could look at Stephen, the first martyr. On Wednesday nights, we're learning through the book of Acts. We're going to come to the encounter Stephen, the first martyr. And as we've looked through the Old Testament, we looked at Jeremiah, and we looked at Moses, we looked at Noah. And yet throughout history, we could also look at people where God has done something radical through. I think about some of the old people of the history like Charles Spurgeon and John Calvin and Billy Graham and Mordecai Ham and many, many, many others. And I can think about today as we look around that God is still using people. God uses people in a radical way, people that you would never imagine, people that are just normal, ordinary, or nobodies, that God calls them to do something extraordinary, something out of the comfort zone, something out of the culture that we see in our world today. And many people do this, and I'm thankful for people who do this. And as you look through these series, you realize that God is going to call people to do radical things. But what I love about this story today is it gets real personal. It gets real personal because it's going to challenge you on a personal level. As we close this series, that's my hope, that's my goal, is that we don't look at just these as stories of the past or stories of other people. We look to them as stories of our own lives. Where in my life will the radical God of call come? And if it comes, will I be willing, or am I willing to accept that call and to do something radical for God? Regardless of my comfort zone, regardless of my economic status, regardless of my marital status, regardless of my age, am I willing to do that? And you know what I found in life as a pastor and even as a Christian, this call comes in all different shapes and sizes. Sometimes that call comes when you're a young person. I see God do things through young people that's just extraordinary. It's just amazing. See there? Amen, right there. There's one extraordinary one right there, right? I see things that God does through middle-aged people, and God calls them in the middle of their life to do something radical. And you look at it and say, what in the world are you doing this now for? And then you look at those seasoned people. Don't you like that word? Seasoned, right? That's the old people, by the way, all right? Seasoned. The older I get, the more new names I come up for old people because I realize I'm becoming one of those seasoned people, right? 15 years ago, we started our church. Can you believe that? I'll talk about it a little bit later on. Looking back at the pictures, Courtney always tells me, you had a lot of pepper in your hair back then, Dad. Now, you got a lot of salt up there, a lot more gray. What you don't realize is she gave me those gray hairs, all right? The boys were easy. The girl, oh my goodness, they will really turn your hair gray quickly. But whether you're young, whether you're old, whether you're middle-aged, if you have breath in you, if God has you on this earth, He has a purpose and plan for your life. And at some point in your life, the question is not if God is going to call you to do it, but when God calls you to do something radical, are you going to answer the call? Are you going to step up to the bell? Are you going to be the one who answers God's call? Are you going to answer that number when it's called? And I think about these stories, and I thought about it in my own life. How are you going to respond? Would you have built the ark if you was Noah and you got that call? Would you have been willing to trust God to build the ark? Would you have been like Daniel and been willing to be thrown in a lion's den? I mean, he trusted God in a way that got him put in a lion. Would you be like Moses to be so radical for God to say, God, show me all of your glory. I want all of it in my life. Would you be willing to surrender everything to it, even in our own life today? Are you willing to change your career? What if God got a hold of your heart and you need to change your career? Are you willing to sell your home, to move to a different place that God may have you to do something radical for Him? Are you willing to go to seminary and get education, and get training from God to be able to minister to people or to pastor people or to be a missionary? Would you be willing to adopt a child into your family? You know, we talk a lot about abortion as Christians. We talk a lot about how we believe in life, but how many of you would be willing to adopt a child? How many would be willing to foster a family? How many would be willing to put your money where your mouth is and say, hey, I believe this, but God's called me to do this something radical. I'm willing to step up to the plate. You know, most of you know that I love watching college football, mostly. Last couple of years hadn't been so great because of my team, but I'm not going to talk about my team today. I'm going to talk about another team because I like watching and following them. The Clemson Tigers. You got any Clemson Tiger fans in here? The Clemson Tigers, the reason why I like Clemson Tigers is because their head coach, his name's Dabo Swinney, all right? Isn't that a good South Carolina name? Dabo Swinney, all right? Dabo Swinney was just an assistant coach. Literally, he was a nobody who had a lot of experience around a lot of other coaches and stuff, but when the head coaching vacancy happened at Clemson, the last person on the list to become the head coach at Clemson would have been Dabo Swinney. And a lot of the experts looked at him and said he didn't have the qualifications. He doesn't have the personality. He doesn't have the organizational skills. He doesn't have it. He doesn't have it to lead a major university. And the day he was chosen, much to the despise of all the experts, they interviewed him several years ago, and they had him on this interview, and the guy asked him, said, well, many people will say that Clemson's taking a chance on you. They're making a bet that you're going to work out, and it's a gamble. And Dabo said, yes, it may be a bet, but it's a good one. You know why it's a good one? Because I believe this is God's purpose for my life. He has raised me up for this time and in this place to be able to be the coach, and with God's help and with God's power, I'm going to be the best coach I could possibly be and let Him get all the glory and all the honor for it. And if you know what Dabo Swinney's done in the last couple of years, you know that he's considered probably the greatest football coach Clemson has ever had. And compared to his age to other coaches, he's possibly one of the best college coaches in football today. Matter of fact, he's the richest college football coach in today. He just got the biggest contract there ever was. But after winning the championship a couple years ago, he said in an interview after the game, he said, I know this is little old Clemson. And I know I'm just a nobody that shouldn't be here. But we're here and I'm here because God had challenged me and I answered the call and I met the challenge, and God has done something unexplainable in my life. Isn't that a great thing? I mean, to see that happen. And the question is, are you ready to answer God's call in your life? Are you willing to put that challenge on the line? And you know, we live in a world that's turned soft, it's turned lukewarm to God's commands in our life. I've said that before. Our modern day Christianity is watered down. It's weak. It doesn't call. It doesn't have you be salt and light. And as God is looking in this, did my microphone go out, by the way? It did, didn't it? No? Okay. All right. Okay, good. When people start looking like that, I start wondering. The guy's called, that's not what you're looking. Okay. All right. I got something on my face? Oh, wait a minute. My zipper's up? Okay, I was just making sure. Anyways, we live in a world where Christians not being salt and light. God's looking to change us. And the question is, are you willing to answer the call? Well, let me tell you, I got lost in this story earlier because this story is a great story. I mean, I love this story. Most people say it's one of my favorite stories, and I say that every week. I realize that. But this is a really, really, really good story about answering the call. I mean, it gets so clear and it's so perfectly put that you can get lost in this story. But I don't want you to get lost in the fact of asking you the question, are you ready to answer the call? And that story is in Elijah. If you have it comes in Elijah on his showdown on Mount Carmel. If you turn to 1 Kings chapter 18, that's where we're going to begin. And when you begin turning there, I'm going to give you some background information. If you've ever been able to tour the Holy Land, which I have not, I've seen some videos and I've seen some YouTube stuff on about it. But one of the places they take you is up on Mount Carmel. And Mount Carmel was very important. It was an enormous mountain that was by the sea, and people could see several different views from that area. And whoever usually controlled Mount Carmel controlled the area. And whoever ruled the top of Mount Carmel many times had the most power and the most influence. And in the Old Testament, you can track this through the reasons for military purposes, for political purposes, and for spiritual purposes. Well, the nation of Israel had ruled, and the northern part had ruled the part of Mount Carmel. And yet what happened through the northern part of the nation is that they had a king named Ahab. And this king named Ahab, and the people of God began to compromise with these people who would worship Baal. They were worshiping this false god Baal. And you know, this area was a great, big agricultural type people. And they were reliant on their crops. They were reliant on the rain. They were reliant on a lot of different things that would come from an agricultural society. And so the idolatry or the idol Baal, this false deity, controlled the seasons, controlled the rains, controlled the crops. And so they said, well, we're going to make a religion out of this, and we're going to have these priests and these Baals, and they begin to compromise and they begin to worship Baal. And Ahab began to allow that to happen. And as they begin to do this, they begin to compromise and it began to take over the whole nation. And before you knew it, pretty much everyone in the whole country was worshiping Baal and trying to worship God at the same time. Well, we all know that God's commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. God does not play second fiddle. He does not allow us to have idolatry in our life. And as we see this showdown here on Mount Carmel, Elijah is called by God to interrupt this. He's called by God to confront this. And so God tells Elijah, you're going to go tell Ahab, which Elijah was a nobody. He was just a mountain man. He was just a man that was of obscurity. His name literally meant the Lord is my God. He was in the mountains. God tapped him on the shoulder, commanded him to go to Ahab. And he said, I want you to go to Ahab, and I want you to tell him this. You have come in the name of the living God. I'm not putting up with it anymore, and I'm the God of Israel, and you stand before him and you tell him there will be no more rain until you get word from me again. And then I want you to run from him because he's going to try to kill you, and a lot of people are going to try to kill you, and you go hide in the brook at Terebinth, and we'll hear other stories in here where you see the miracle of the widow, and where he was at Zarephath and Sidonian territory and different things like that. But meanwhile, while he was on the run, the nation of Israel went into extreme famine. Sure enough, it didn't rain a drop. And for more than 3 years, not one single raindrop. I don't know, that sounds like a pretty good alternative right now, does it not? Doesn't it feel like it's rained every single day this month or this last couple of months? When we moved to Florida, we were originally from Arizona, moved into Texas for a little while, but then we came here. I think it rained 41 days straight the day we moved here. And we thought, man, this is crazy. Being from Arizona, it was great to see rain every once in a while. But for here, 3 years, not one single drop. The crops had been gone. The prosperous Jordan River had been down to a trickle. There were crops dying. There were vines dying, or all the produce was dying. Animals were dying and laying in the fields and carcasses. It was scarce. It was compromise. It was that God's judgment was falling, that God was time for them to look to God and what they were doing, and God was preparing them through this famine. And so as Elijah is moving around, God finally is ready. And we pick up the story in chapter 18 for Elijah to finish the mission or to answer the rest of his call. And verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah. And in the third year, saying, Go, present yourself to Ahab, and I will send the rain on the earth." And so Elijah went himself to present himself to Ahab, the first part of verse 2. So God comes to Elijah and says, "It's go time. I sent you there, but now it's time to follow through. It's time for you to answer. It's time for you to go to tell Ahab, here's the reason why for 3 years God is going to speak and God is going to answer your call of why there's no rain." So then he goes through a process of meeting this other guy. Drop down to verse 17. You can read the story later on, but it's got long stories, so I could get through it. So drop down to verse 17. Then it happened. So he went. Then through the serious process, it finally happened, verse 17. "When Ahab saw Elijah," this is what we read here, "that Ahab said to him, 'Is that you, O troubler of Israel?' And he answered, 'I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have. It is you who has forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals.'" You see that? So Ahab sees Elijah, goes, "That's you, you little troubler of Israel." The word literally means a snake. There you are, you dirty little snake. There you are, hiding out, and you caused all this trouble and this problems, and you've caused these issues for our country and my people. And you know, the first thing I want to point out is you realize that when you are doing something for God, you're going to be despised by the world, right? As in, you go messing around with the world, you go messing around with worldly things, you're going to have people come against you that's going to ridicule and mock you. And here was Ahab, the reason why he had allowed these people to be in idolatry as the king, and the people who had fallen away from God. And what he comes up with is it was Elijah's fault. It's your fault, you little troubler of Israel. But I love this part. Elijah stands up and he don't take none of that. He says, "It ain't me, it's you. You're the one, and Israel's the one. You have forsaken God. You have followed after Baals." Now, let me think about this in our life, in our time. Many times in our culture, we can do a lot of things, and we can be nice, and we can be cordial, and we can cooperate with them. But there's going to come a time when you need to take a stand, and you're going to have to take a stand, and you're going to have to stay and look to the culture, to people in your life, and say, "This is not true, this is not the case, and I'm not to blame, and God is not to blame. You're to blame. Sin is to blame. Idolatry is to blame." Elijah takes this stand. And he's like, "I'm not the problem. You're the problem. I'm calling sin the way that sin is." You know, our culture today, we don't like this because we're too politically correct, right? And listen, we don't have to be mean to be holy, right? We all know holy people that are mean too, right? Like they tell people they're going to hell and looks like they enjoy telling that, right? Like we don't want to be like that. Like we don't want to be judgmental. We don't want to talk down to people or condescend to people. But let me tell you, there should be some lines drawn in our families. There should be lines drawn in our marriages, lines drawn in our church, lines drawn from this world and saying, "Hey, this far and no further." Like this is where we take the stand. Have you noticed in our culture today that everyone can speak out of what they believe in and all the crazy stuff and they're all accepted, but when someone steps out to say something about Christ or Christianity or the Bible, they're immediately ridiculed and attacked and said, "You're the problem, you're judgmental, you're hateful, you're bigot, you're racist," and all the rest of the stuff they come up with? You know why that is? Because every time you take a stand for God and you go against the world, get ready, ridicule's coming. And no different for Elijah. Elijah was there and he got ridiculed. And I think today, for our culture and for young people today, they got to realize that they got to fight through that ridicule sometimes. You know, some of our kids and some of our families and some people won't take a stand for the Lord because they're afraid if someone might send a post out about them or say they say something bad about them on social media or whatever. But listen, it doesn't matter what social media says. It doesn't matter what the culture says. It doesn't matter what the world says. Elijah says, "You've offended God. You've broken his principles. I'm not the problem. You are." And it's time for the truth to come out. Look at verse 19. He says, "Now gather all the people," this is Elijah, "gather all the people and bring them to Mount Carmel for me." And he says, "Bring all 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Now he says, "I want all the people to come, and I want all the prophets to come of Baal, and I want all your wife's prophets, or all those who do of Asherah pole, and they worship this other false deity. I want them there too." Now Jezebel was Ahab's wife. And Jezebel was an evil, mean woman. Ladies, if someone calls you a Jezebel, that's not an endearing term, all right? Men, if you call a woman Jezebel, get ready because you might get punched in the mouth, all right? It's not an endearing term. She was not a nice person, an extremely wicked person. And so Elijah's saying, hey, get your prophets, get your wife's prophets, get every single one of them, gather them up, and let's have a showdown on Mount Carmel. Now think about this. Here was Elijah. 850 prophets alone. Think about that. 850 to 1. And here was little old mountain man Elijah. He was either crazy or in touch with God, right? That's the only two choices you could come up with. And Elijah knew he was called by God. That he wasn't crazy. And he said, my God, and he's with me, and I have the faith and the courage to trust God more than what I see with my eyes. And let me tell you, when God called you to do something, it takes faith and it takes courage. And God's never going to call you to do something that you can explain or you can see. It's always going to take courage. It's always going to take faith. God never calls you to do something radical in a comfortable way. He never does. When God calls you to do something, it's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to have to be willing to be courageous. You're going to have to be willing to say, I'm trusting God, even though I don't see the results from this. I can't see the end of this, but God has called me to do this, and I'm going to do this. Listen, in your home as parents, many times as you raise your children, you don't have any conclusions you can draw about how your children's going to be. And many times you got to say, we're taking this stand for God, and we're going to raise our children this way, and we're going to trust God in the process that when we get to the end of this, God is going to answer our obedience. Sometimes in our marriages, we may not understand it, we may not see it, but sometimes you got to say, this is what God has called us to do, and I'm going to trust Him, and we're going to do it. In our finances, in our careers, sometimes we might say, God, I don't see the end of this, and I don't know why you would call me to do this, or why I'm not equipped to do this, but God, I'm trusting you. It's all in your hands, and I'm trusting by faith and with courage that I can't control it, and I can't see how it ends, but I'm trusting you, God, regardless of the conclusion. And that's what Elijah was doing. He was saying 850 to 1. It goes back to what I've said earlier in this message. You and God is a majority. You're never in the minority when God's on your side. And Elijah knew this, and he was willing to take the stand. And I think for me, this is one thing that keeps most Christians from doing something for God. We want it all figured out. We want it all planned out. And we don't want to be interrupted, but yet God always calls us to do things that requires faith and courage in our life. Listen, here was Elijah. He was a nobody. And I think about this much in my life. I was a nobody in my life. I am a nobody. And yet I look to what God has called me to do in my life 15 years ago to be pastor. I didn't know what I was doing. Most of you say, I still don't know what I'm doing, but I don't know. But I know that God has called me to do this. And let me tell you, we had recently been married. We had a child on the way. We built our home. We had started our career, our family, and a business. And we were serving in a church. And we were happy serving and being a part of a local church. And when God called me to be a pastor, I thought, there's no possible way. There's no way, because I don't have the training, I don't have the understanding, I don't have the personality, I don't have the gifts. But yet I knew if God called me to do it, I would have to trust in Him. I would have to have faith in Him. And let me tell you, it takes courage. It takes courage to get out of your comfort zone. And maybe some of you here this morning, you say, you know what, God's called me to be the spiritual leader of my family, but I can't do it. Well, let me tell you, if God has called you to do it, you need to have the faith and the courage to say, God, I'm going to start this process because I trust in you and your plan for my life. Maybe God's calling some of you to go into ministry. Maybe God's calling some of you to take a stand at your school as a young person. Maybe God's calling you to take a stand in your community and say, hey, I don't know how this is going to work out, but God has called me to do this, and I have faith and trust in Him, and I have the courage to trust God, even though I don't see the results. And Elijah looked, and he sees 850 prophets, and he sees all the people against him, and he still stands up and says, let's do it. Let's get on top of Mount Carmel, and let's have this showdown. Back to the story. You guys got me off track. Look, he cuts to the top of Mount Carmel. Look at verse 20. It says, so Ahab sent the word throughout all of Israel. He summons them all, and he assembles all the prophets on Mount Carmel. And Elijah went before the people, and he stands up, and here's what he tells them. He says, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. And the most important part comes next. But the people said nothing. Think about that. I mean, here was the people of God who was to be on God's side, to be on his ways. And of all the things that Elijah told to them, he said, you're faltering between two opinions. What is the opinion? What do you have to say about that? They said nothing. They were spiritually apathetic. And that's what happens. We get lukewarm and we get apathetic when we compromise. We don't want to take a stand and we say, well, one way or the other, it doesn't really matter. Yes, it matters. When it comes to God's call, it comes to God's principles, it matters. And we can't stand on the fence. I love what Elijah says. He says, if it is, and if it's not, then don't serve God. But if it is, do it wholeheartedly. Don't do it half-heartedly. Do it all. And this is one reason why I love Elijah. He's so practical and he's so personal. He's like, listen, don't buy a book. Don't think about it. Don't take time to think about it. He's saying, do it and do it with all your heart immediately. If this is proven to you who God is, then follow him. Stop riding the fence. And by the way, we can't ever ride the fence, right? You know what happens when you ride the fence? You get wore out because you try to put one foot with God and one foot with the world. That never works. You can't ever compromise. You either got to be all in for God or you're not all in, or you're all in for the world. You can't be lukewarm. And Jesus warns us about the church that gets lukewarm. He warns us about the Christians. He says they are apathetic. They become spiritually inept. And they have one foot in the world and one foot in Christianity. Just as Elijah says, Jesus says the same thing. That won't cut it. I'm not going to accept that. And he looks to the people of Israel and says, choose who you may serve. If it is God, do it with all your heart. If it's not, then get off the fence and don't even say you're part of God. There's no compromise. You know, it comes to a point in our life where we're going to have to do this. We're going to have to decide, are we all in for Jesus Christ or are we all out for Jesus Christ? He puts it on the table, and that's what I love about it. You know, when you read through the Gospels and you read through the message of Jesus Christ through the Gospels, he never was indifferent about his message. He never says, hey, try it for 30 days if you like it. Hey, sign on for the plan, you know what I mean? He doesn't say, hey, try it until it comes a hard time and then you can go do your own thing. No, he says, if you come after me, take up your cross and follow me, right? He says, if you're going to come after me, who puts his hand to the plow, don't ever look back. Whoever looks back is not worthy of taking their hand on the plow. He makes it clear. He even says in there, either you're for God or you're against God. He makes it plain. And so many times we try to make it more than it is. The question is, are you all in for God or you're not? And Elijah says it's time for you to decide. And in your life, you're going to have to come to that time where you decide. It's a time when you're going to have to decide, am I all in for God? Most of you know last year, around this time, I did a series through the book of Jonah. You remember that story? And we went through that series. And part of the process that God taught me last year through the things that we went through as a family and for me personally, was the question was, am I really completely and totally surrendered to God? Or do I try to control and manipulate certain things in my life that I don't really trust God for? And let me tell you, God has a way of putting things in our life to get us to where we're flat on our back, to where we finally have to throw our hands up and say, okay, God, it's all in your hands. You know what? It's always in his hands anyways. The question is, are we going to let go of it? And Elijah's telling him here, you gotta make up your mind. You got to be all in for God. If he answers, you got to say he's God and I'm putting it all in. And so Elijah says here, let's put our money where our mouth is. Here's what he says in verse 22. He says, I want to show you this. Elijah said to the people, I alone am left as a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Therefore, let them give us 2 bulls, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other bull, lay it on the wood, and put no fire under it. And then you call on the name of your gods, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. And so all the people answered and said, it is well, it is spoken. They agreed to it. So he says, you're going to put one on your altar. I'll put one on my altar. You call out on your gods and see if fire consumes your sacrifice. I will call on my God or the Lord, and we'll see if he answers by fire. And so they all agreed, and they said, yes, this is the experiment. We will understand this. If God answers, or whichever God answers, that's the God. Look at verse 25. It says, now Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, he says, go ahead, get your bull, prepare it, and for as many as you are, call on your God and put no fire under it. So they took the bull, they prepared it, they called on the name of Baal from morning till evening. So they called all the way from the sunrise until noon, saying, "O Baal, hear us." But there was no voice. No one answered, and they leaped about the altar which they had made. And so it was at noon that Elijah mocked them. Must have been a Tennessee fan, right? He was mocking them like, I was teasing Robert. He was teasing them. He was like, hey, listen, here's your God. Hey, cry aloud. For if he is God, maybe he's meditating, or maybe he's busy, or maybe he's on a journey, or perhaps he is sleeping. He must be awakened. And so they cried aloud and they cut themselves, which was their custom was, in their religious practices, and with their knives and lances, and blood gushed out on them. And yet midday had passed, and they prophesied until the time of the offering, all the way to the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. Let me tell you, that's the way false gods answers. So many times we as Christians and those of the world think they can find the answers to life in false gods, but let me tell you, they don't answer. In your time of need, they won't be there. When you're all alone and you're on the death's door, they won't be there. You can call, but they're not going to answer. You can call when you have issues in your marriage, but they're not going to answer. You can call when you have problems with your children, but they're not going to answer because they're no gods. They're false gods. And they can't answer, and they're not going to answer. And Elijah looks to him and says, there was no voice, not single one, not one single person. They always fail. They always let you down. Listen, the gods of this world are a mirage. Listen, so many times we fall for that. We think if I could just have more money, if I could just have more cars, if I could just have more possessions, if we could just let our kids live their own life, they could be good people and they could do these things. And we think the ways of the world will help our families and our kids and our lives, but it won't. The gods of this world will always leave us dry. It will always pull us away from God. And in the crisis times, in the times when we need it most, God will always, that God will always fail. It always will. By the way, you know, when people put in the crisis of their lives, you notice how they never call on any other God but the God of heaven? You know, and when you get in a crisis time in your life, you realize that that's when the rubber meets the road. And these gods had no voice. They had no answer. No one even listened. Finish the story in verse 30. It says, then Elijah said to the people, he's like, here, come back in. Get closer. Get closer to me. They wasn't Baptist. Maybe they were Baptist. They were all in the back row. They're like, here, come closer. Come up to the front rows, all right? Come up here where nobody comes up here, all right? Come up here a little closer. I want you to see this. And he says, first he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. I mean, that alone can preach a sermon, could it not? I mean, he went back to the place to where they met God the first time. He's like, at one time, this mountain represented the worship of God. And at one time, this is where the people of God met God. But this altar was broken. It was torn down. It was no longer there. And Elijah repaired that altar. And what a beautiful picture for us as Christians to go back to the Lord and say, God, I've left you at the altar. I left my heart there. And I've walked away from you, God. But the good news is we can repair that altar. I love God. He's not God of a second chance. He's the God of another chance. And here was Elijah telling the people, God hasn't given up on you. I'm going to go back to where you left, God, and we're going to repair that altar, and let's see if God will meet with us there. And this morning, that's my challenge to you. Go back to where you know where God is or where you left God and see if God will answer. And I'm telling you, just as the story says, he will answer. Look at verse 31. Elijah took 12 stones and he brought them up and he numbered them as a tribe, the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. Then with the stones he built an altar, and in the name of the Lord he made a trench around that altar big enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order and cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the wood and said, fill 4 water pots of water and pour it on the burnt sacrifice on the wood. And then he said, do it a second time. And they did it a second time. He said, do it a third time. And they did it a third time. So water ran out all the altar, and which was filled the trenches in the water. I'm not the smartest guy. but I know that fire does not work well with water, right? And so Elijah's saying, I want you to know without question, this is not magic. This is not a trick. I want you to put this altar and I want you to dump this water on it, so much so that it was full of water and water overflowed and it was a whole trough of water all the way around the whole sacrifice. You know what Elijah was doing? He was putting all his eggs in God's basket. He's like, God, you got to do it. And you got to do it all because there's nothing I can do. And he puts it all on the line. And look at verse 36. And it came to pass at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice that Elijah the prophet came near and said, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Man, wouldn't you have loved to have been there to see this? I mean, think about this. Here was Elijah standing up there and he says, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that I've done all these things at your word. God, I think Elijah just kind of reminded God, right? God, you are God, and you told me to do this, God, right? Like, I put it all in your hands, but I really need to see you work through this, right? Like, God, this is all that you have. This is all that I have. I've put my whole life in this. Everything I got is in this moment. And he says, you've told me to do this, and I'm your servant, and I'm commanded at your word. And he says, verse 37, hear me, O Lord, hear me. And man, you ever been to a prayer and that's all you can say is, God, hear me, God. Hear me, Lord. This is Elijah calling on the name of the Lord. He's like, hear me, God. I need you. And yet, not only me, but then he immediately says, then this people may know that you are God and that you have turned their hearts back to you again, Lord. Not just for me, God, but for all these, for my kids and for my family, for this whole nation, God. God, do this and answer so that not only I, but the people who have turned away from you can see this. And look at verse 38. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones and his dust, and it licked up the water as it was in the trench. Man, I would love to sing that, right? I mean, the fire fell so great, the water licked up out of the water of the trench. I mean, it sucked the whole earth dry. And all the people saw it, and they fell on their faces, and they said, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. What a story. I mean, what an amazing example of going all in for God and God going all out. One pastor said this, and I said this before earlier in my sermons, when God shows up, He shows out, right? I mean, when God shows up, He can do exceedingly abundantly more than we could ever even think or imagine in our lives. And many times we get overwhelmed and we think, God, I can't do this and I can't do this. And we begin to tell God He can't do these things in our life. But if we would ever get to the point to where we fully surrender to Him and we fully put it on the altar of God, when God answers, He answers in a big time way. He does it in a way that's unbelievable. And listen, I know as we come in here this morning, we got many things in our life that you may be wrestling with. And you might be saying, well, my marriage is done. There is no way God can do that. There's no way God can do something in my marriage. Hey, listen, I can promise you, I could tell you thousands of stories of people who are right where you were that God did something incredible in their marriage. Maybe it's with a child that you have. You say, you know what, I'm done with that child. There's no hope for my child. My child has walked away from the Lord, or my child is not living for God, and there's nothing I can do. Well, that's good news, because when you get to the end of yourself and you put it all on the altar, God can answer, and God can change, and God could be the one that does something exceedingly more than you could ever even imagine in your life. Or maybe it's in your career or your finances. Maybe it's a point where you say, God, we have nothing. This is all that we got. Let me tell you, then when you get to that point, if you put it all in God's hands and you trust in the Lord and the call of God in your life, He can answer. And what a great difference between the gods who can't answer and the one and true God who answered in such a way that it was miraculous. And I love what it says. They all fell down on their face and they all worshiped the Lord. Man. When we get into the presence of God and He does it, there's no explaining it. He gets all the glory and all the honor for it. You know, in your life, you put these things on the altar of God and watch Him work. People will look and say, wow, I can't believe God could do something like that in your life. and He will, and He can. I mean, what a challenge. And as we wrap up this morning, that's the challenge I have for you. What is it in your life that God has called you to do? What is it in your life, or what moment in your life do you need to meet that challenge? You know, Dabo Sweeney, when he was going through his year when he won the national championship, you know what the mantra for that year was, or the theme was for that year? I loved it. Some of the ladies may not like it, but it was called Bring Your Own Guts. That's what he said. He's like, these are the type of games and moments to where you need to bring your own guts, that you're going to get hit in the mouth. You're going to be challenged. You're going to be strained to the max. You're going to be, the challenge will be greater than you think you can handle. But you got to meet that challenge. You got to bring your own guts. And let me tell you, this life will challenge you. I would to stand here and say that you're never going to have troubles or trials, or you're never going to go through health crises, or you're never going to have problems in your marriage, you're never going to have problems with your children. No, you will have problems. You will have challenges. You will have moments where it overwhelms you. And there are going to be times when God's going to call you to do things that you can't do of yourself. And you got to be willing to stand and say, Lord, I can't do this, but I trust in you that you're the God who can, of Abraham and Isaac and of Israel, and you've done these things, you will do these things, and we will give you all the glory for it. And may this morning, as we sit here, bring our altar to the Lord, and may we repair it and say, Lord, I need to meet with you because I'm ready to put all my chips in, I'm ready to push them all in. I'm ready to meet the challenge because you know what? We live in a dark world. We live in a world who needs the hope of Jesus Christ. We live in a world where the schools are broken, and we need students to be able to go share the gospel with them. We live in a community where families are broken and marriages are broken and morality is broken. And we need Christians. We need people. We need everyday nobodies to stand up and say, I'm not afraid to meet the challenge. I'm going to take a stand. And I know I'll get some persecution. I know I'll get some feedback. But I'm putting it all in for God because He is God. And because He is God, I'm going to serve Him with all my heart. And I don't want anything to do with the ways of this world. Let's pray together this morning.